Fallujah had left its mark, not as a hero's badge, but as a messy, screaming mistake in a lightless room. Now, the melted wax and gravel texture of her left shoulder served only as a punchline for bored Marines, the kind who still hadn't learned the difference between combat and survival. The air inside the makeshift gym at Camp Lemonnier didn't circulate. It just sat there, heavy and tasting faintly of jet exhaust and evaporated sweat. The corrugated tin roof baked under the Djiboutian sun, turning the interior into a convection oven. Jess hung from the pull-up bar, letting the dead weight of her body stretch the tight, ruined fascia in her left shoulder. The bar was slick, with somebody else's sweat. She closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythmic, metallic clank of plates from the bench press across the room. Her lungs burned. Her calluses were torn, weeping clear fluid. But she didn't drop. If she dropped, she'd have to acknowledge the room. She pulled herself up, chin clearing the rusted iron, exhaling in a sharp hiss. Down, up, down. Every extension pulled at the network of keloid tissue that crawled up her collarbone and disappeared beneath the thin strap of her gray tank top. It felt like thick rubber bands snapping tight under her skin. Jesus, look at the meat on that one. The voice cut through the dull hum of the oscillating fan in the corner. Jess didn't break her rhythm, but her jaw tightened. Down, up. Looks like she tried to make out with a wood chipper. That was Corporal Dunn. Jess knew his voice. She knew his type. Fresh off a MIU deployment where the most action he'd seen was a bar fight in Okinawa. Beside him was O'Connor, a heavy-set machine gunner who always smelled faintly of sour milk and chewing tobacco. They were lounging by the water cooler, avoiding their deadlifts, passing the time by dissecting the only woman in the room, the only female seal in the Horn of Africa. Jess dropped from the bar. Her boots hit the rubber matting with a heavy thud. She didn't look at them. She reached for her towel, a ratty olive-drab thing, and began wiping the grease and sweat from her face. "Hey, Cooper," O'Connor called out, his voice lazily draped in false camaraderie. "You get that caught in a blender at Bud, S? Or is that what happens when Navy tries to parallel park a Zodiac?" A few of the other grunts in the gym snickered, low and guttural. Jess wiped her neck. The towel caught on the raised, jagged edge of the primary scar, a deep, bifurcated trench that looked like a lightning bolt stamped into her flesh. It wasn't a clean shrapnel slice. It was a burn. Deep, sustained, and deliberate. She turned around to face them. She didn't offer a stony glare. She just looked tired. Her eyes, bloodshot from the dust and lack of sleep, fixed on Dunn's pristine, unmarred neck. "Something like that," she said. Her voice was scratchy, ruined by the dry air. Dunn chuckled, stepping away from the cooler. He had the arrogant, loose-limbed swagger of a kid who hadn't yet realized he was mortal. "I'm just saying, if they're gonna let chicks into the teams, they could at least issue you guys some cocoa butter. You're scaring the locals, Frogman." "Maybe it's a map," O'Connor chimed in, spitting a stream of brown juice into an empty Gatorade bottle. "Map to the galley. God knows she eats enough for 3 guys. Jess grabbed her water bottle. The plastic crinkled loudly in her grip. A hot spike of irritation flared in her chest, but she stamped it down. Anger was a waste of calories here. She could dismantle Dunn in a dozen ways that wouldn't leave a mark, but that would just prove whatever point they were trying to make. They wanted a reaction. They wanted the freak to act like a freak. She walked past them toward the exit. As she brushed by, she caught the distinct smell of their freshly laundered uniforms, a stark contrast to the deep, embedded grime of her own gear. "Hey, don't run off, Cooper," Dunn said, his tone shifting from mocking to defensive, annoyed that she wasn't playing the game. "Just asking a question." "What, you trip over a tripwire while you were painting your nails?" Jess stopped in the doorway. The blinding white light of the compound spilled in, casting her face in sharp relief. She looked back at Dunn. "IED," she lied flatly. It was the easiest lie. The one people understood. Panjwai. 2 years ago. She didn't wait for his response. She pushed through the heavy canvas flap of the door and walked out into the blinding 110-degree heat. The gravel crunched under her boots. Her shoulder throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache that synced with her heartbeat. It wasn't an IED. An IED was chaotic. An IED was an accident of geometry and timing. The scars on her shoulder were a signature. They were the work of a rusted piece of rebar, superheated over a kerosene stove in a basement in Ramadi, wielded by a man who spoke very soft, very precise English. 7 hours. That's how long she'd been in that chair before the Rangers kicked the door in. She reached up and rubbed the thickest part of the scar, feeling the slick, dead texture of the skin. The Marines didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, she was just a tourist who got sloppy. Let them think it. It was easier than the truth. 3 hours later, the Joint Operations Center smelled like ozone, cheap floor wax, and burnt coffee. It was a prefab structure, heavily fortified, buzzing with the low, constant hum of server racks and encrypted comms. Jess sat in the back row of the briefing room. She had changed into a clean set of cry pants and a tan combat shirt, but the stifling heat of the room forced her to leave the collar unzipped. The jagged edge of the keloid tissue peeked out, rising from her collarbone up the side of her neck, stark white against her sun-baked skin. She was spinning a cheap plastic pen between her fingers, staring blankly at the tactical map projected onto the whiteboard. The room was filling up. Force Recon, a few JSOC guys, and the local ground commanders. Dunn and O'Connor walked in, taking seats 2 rows ahead of her. Dunn spotted her, nudged O'Connor, and mimed, putting a blowtorch to his shoulder. O'Connor snorted, covering his mouth to stifle a laugh. Jess felt a cold, dull weight settle in her stomach. It wasn't hurt. It was utter, profound exhaustion. She looked away, focusing on the dust motes dancing in the harsh beam of the projector. Tenhut. The call ripped through the room. Chairs screeched against the linoleum. Boots snapped together. Jess stood, locking her knees, her eyes fixed forward. General Thomas Reed walked in. He didn't stride. He moved with a heavy, deliberate economy, like a man navigating a minefield. Reed was a relic. 3 stars, 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 in the sandbox. He was a small man, wiry and gray, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old oak and left out in the rain. He smelled faintly of peppermint and gun oil. Seats, Reed grunted, tossing a manila folder onto the podium. The room sat as one. The silence was absolute. Reed commanded a specific type of fear. He wasn't a shouter. He was a mathematician of violence. He only showed up when the calculus required a high body count. Reed leaned over the podium, adjusting his reading glasses. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at his notes. "We have a situation in the Chabois governorate," Reed began, his voice a low, gravel as a say. "Quap has moved a high-value asset into a fortified compound. Intel suggests it's a bomb maker." He clicked a button. The projector flashed, showing blurry drone footage of a walled compound. "We're looking at a joint assault. SEALs on the primary breach, Marines pulling security on the outer cordon." Reed coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I want to be clear. This isn't a knock and talk. This individual is responsible for the embassy bombing in the second row." Dunn leaned over to O'Connor. He didn't whisper quietly enough. "Bet Cooper's gonna sit in the truck," Dunn muttered. "Might break a nail, or melt again." The pen in Jess's hand snapped. Ink exploded over her thumb. She didn't move. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead air of the briefing room, it carried. General Reed stopped speaking. He didn't look up immediately. He slowly lowered his glasses down the bridge of his nose. "Corporal," Reed said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a density that made the air feel thin. Dunn stiffened, his face draining of color. "Sir, do you have a tactical addition to this briefing, or are you just aerating your teeth?" "No, sir." Apologies, sir. Dunn stared straight ahead, a bead of sweat breaking out on his temple. Reed held the silence for a painful, agonizing 5 seconds. Then his gaze swept over Dunn's head, moving to the back of the room to identify the source of the distraction. His eyes tracked over the rows of identical haircuts and tan uniforms. Then he saw her. Jess was sitting completely still, the broken pen leaking blue ink onto her knuckles. She looked back at the general. Reed's eyes locked onto her face, then drifted down to the open collar of her shirt, to the exposed, creeping edge of the white scar tissue on her neck, to the very specific, bifurcated pattern where the burn branched out like a dead tree. General Thomas Reed stopped breathing. It was imperceptible to the untrained eye, but Jess saw it. The microscopic tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers, resting lightly on the edge of the podium, suddenly gripped the wood so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The color completely vanished from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He stood perfectly frozen. The silence in the room stretched from uncomfortable to deeply, suffocatingly wrong. 10 seconds passed. 15. Sir? The JSOC liaison near the front prompted softly. Reed didn't blink. He was staring at Jess's shoulder. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, charged with a strange electrical panic. He knew. Jess felt her heart kick against her ribs. He recognized it. It wasn't just a burn. The man with the rebar in Ramadi had a specific method. He created a Z pattern, crossing the collarbone, branching up to the carotid. A signature, a calling card. The man in Ramadi was named Tariq, and 10 years before Jess was strapped to that chair, Tariq had done the exact same thing to a young Marine lieutenant in Fallujah, a lieutenant named David Reed, the general's only son. David hadn't survived the chair. General Reed slowly raised a trembling hand and took off his glasses. The stoic, terrifying commander was gone. In his place was an old man, staring at a ghost carved into the flesh of a stranger. "Where?" Reed choked out. His voice was a brittle whisper that cracked over the microphone. He cleared his throat violently, trying to find his command voice, but failed. "Where did you get that?" The entire room turned to look at Jess. Dunn, O'Connor, the JSOC guys. 50 pairs of eyes snapping from the pale, trembling general to the silent female SEAL in the back row. Jess looked at the ink on her hands. She could feel the phantom heat of the rebar. She could smell the kerosene. "Ramadi, sir," Jess said. Her voice was steady, but it sounded hollow in her own ears. 3 years ago. Reed stared at her. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask why. He knew exactly what had happened in that room. He knew the sounds. He knew the smell. He knew that anyone who carried that specific mark had been dragged through a very specific corner of hell, and he knew that surviving it required a darkness that most of the men in this room couldn't even conceptualize. He looked from Jess's scarred neck to Corporal Dunn, who was now sitting rigidly, utterly confused by the general's breakdown. Reed looked back at Jess. The silence was deafening. Finally, the general swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "My office," Reed said. His voice was completely hollowed out. "After the briefing, Petty Officer Cooper." He didn't wait for her to acknowledge. He turned back to the projector, his hands shaking so badly he had to put them behind his back. "Marines," Reed said, his voice dropping an octave, returning with a cold, terrifying venom that made the hairs on the back of Jess's neck stand up. He stared directly at Dunn. "You will shut your mouths for the remainder of this brief. If I hear a single whisper, I will personally ensure your next deployment is counting sand in the single most hostile grid square on this continent. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir." The room barked in unison. Dunn swallowed hard, looking straight ahead, suddenly realizing he had been poking a tiger with a very short stick. Jess wiped the ink off her thumb onto her pants. The throbbing in her shoulder was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. The briefing continued, but the air in the room had fundamentally changed. The Marines weren't looking at her like a joke anymore. They were looking at her like an unexploded bomb. General Reed's office was a plywood box shoved into the corner of the command center. It smelled overwhelmingly of stale Folgers, industrial floor wax, and the dry, metallic tang of an overworked air conditioning unit rattling in the window. Jess stood at parade rest just inside the door. The plywood walls were thin enough that she could hear the muffled, frantic chatter of the JOC outside. But inside, the silence was suffocating. Reed stood with his back to her, staring out the tiny plexiglass window at the sun-bleached staging area. He had taken off his uniform blouse. In just his undershirt, he looked frail. His shoulders slouched under the weight of an invisible, crushing atmosphere. For 3 minutes, neither of them spoke. The AC unit hummed. A drop of condensation fell from the vent and hit a stack of paper on his desk with a soft pap. "They found David in a basement," Reed said. He didn't turn around. His voice was scraped flat, devoid of the terrifying command it held in the briefing room. Fallujah, November 2004. He was missing for 3 days before a force recon element kicked the door in. Jess kept her eyes fixed on a peeling strip of laminate on the edge of his desk. Her left shoulder was throbbing, a deep, rhythmic spike of phantom heat that radiated down to her fingertips. "The coroner told me it was a heart attack," Reed continued, his breath fogging the hot plexiglass. "Said the pain just overloaded the system. Shut him down. He tried to spare me the details, but I saw the photographs. I saw the marks." He finally turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, sinking deep into the weathered topography of his face. He looked at Jess, not at her uniform, not at her trident. He looked at the jagged white flesh creeping up her neck. "Tariq," Jess said. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She hadn't said it out loud in 3 years. Reed nodded slowly. He walked over to his desk, heavily lowering himself into his chair. It squeaked in protest. He reached for a manila envelope, the same one from the podium, and slid it across the desk toward her. "The HVT in Shabwa," Reed said, his finger tapping the cardboard. Naval intelligence flagged him as a bomb maker, a mid-level facilitator. The name on the file is Al-Hassan, but the intercept chatter. The psychological profile. They talk about a man who doesn't just build IEDs. He builds puzzles. He builds traps designed to maim first responders. Jess felt a cold spike of adrenaline punch through her exhaustion. Tariq wasn't a fighter. He was an artist of agony. He wired doors to blow only when the medic rushed in. He left bleeding bait. "You think Al-Hassan is Tariq?" Jess said. "I don't think. I know," Reed said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I've spent 10 years hunting a ghost. He moves across borders, changes his name, but he can't change his signature. He's in that compound." Reed leaned forward, folding his hands together on the desk. His knuckles were white. "I am sending a platoon of Marines to pull the outer cordon. I am sending a SEAL troop to breach the main house. I am sitting in this chair, thousands of miles away, managing a map. But you?" He let the sentence hang. He was a general of the United States Marine Corps, and he was asking a petty officer for permission to be human. "You know his mind, Cooper. You know the architecture of that house before you even step inside, because you know how he thinks." Reed swallowed hard. "I need you on the primary breach." Jess's stomach twisted into a cold, wet knot. The rational part of her brain, the operator, screamed at her to step back. She was compromised. This wasn't a mission. This was an execution layered in 10 years of generational trauma. She was terrified. The thought of being in the same grid square as Tariq made the bile rise in her throat. She could smell the kerosene. She could hear the soft, rhythmic scraping of the rebar against the concrete floor before he lifted it. She wanted to say no, but she looked at the old man behind the desk. He wasn't giving an order. He was begging. "He wires the hinges," Jess said softly, staring at the envelope, "not the handles. He puts the tripwires at shin level. not ankle level, because guys step over the thresholds. If there's a hallway, the primary explosive is in the ceiling to catch the stack, not the floor. General Reed closed his eyes. A single ragged exhale shuddered out of his lungs. "Take the point," Reed whispered. "Yes, sir." Jess turned and grabbed the door handle. "Cooper," Reed called out. She paused, looking over her shoulder. The general was staring at her, his face a mask of grief and cold, terrible resolve. "Don't let him surrender." The MH-60 Black Hawk vibrated so violently Jess felt it in her teeth. The cabin was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the pilot's instrument panels and the moonlight bleeding through the open side doors. The air moving through the cabin was freezing, but underneath her heavy plate carrier, Jess was drenched in sweat. It smelled of hydraulic fluid, unwashed bodies, and the distinct coppery tang of pre-mission adrenaline. Across from her sat the Marines attached for the outer cordon. Dunn was right across from her knees. In the green wash of her night vision goggles, he looked like a child wearing his father's armor. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscle pulsed rapidly. He wasn't smirking now. The sterile bravado of the gym was gone, replaced by the crushing, claustrophobic reality of a combat drop. Jess didn't look at him. She was obsessively checking the action on her suppressed Mk-18. Rack the bolt, feel the brass, tap the magazine, over and over. Her left shoulder ached with a deep, sickening rhythm. 1 minute, the crew chief bellowed over the rotor wash. The helicopter banked sharply, dropping out of the sky like a stone. Jess grabbed the ceiling strap. Her stomach floated. Through the door, the mud brick walls of the Chabois compound rushed up to meet them in a cloud of blinding brown dust. "Go, go, go!" Jess dropped from the skids, her boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with a bone-jarring thud. The noise was absolute. The rotors beat the air into a physical force. She moved immediately, cutting through the swirling dust toward the primary wall. Her troop fell in behind her, a silent, synchronized organism of violence. Off to her right, she saw Dunn and O'Connor sprinting toward the perimeter berm, taking up firing positions to lock down the street. The breach team reached the heavy wooden gate. The breacher slapped a strip of C4 against the lock, primed it, and stepped back. Breaching, breaching, breaching. The explosion was a dull, heavy thump that punched the air out of Jess's lungs. The gate blew inward in a shower of splinters and dust. Jess flowed through the smoke. She didn't run. She glided, her rifle up, scanning the dark courtyard. The sensory input was overwhelming: the smell of pulverized brick, the acrid bite of the explosive, the bleating of a panicked goat tied to a post. Showtime. They reached the main house, a heavy iron door. The breacher moved up, but Jess threw out a hand, grabbing his shoulder plate. She stopped him dead. She knelt. The green hue of her NVGs turned the world into a monochromatic nightmare. She traced the edge of the doorframe with her gloved fingers. There, a hairline fracture in the mortar near the top hinge. A wire, no thicker than a fishing line, ran from the hinge up into the corrugated tin roof. He wired the hinges, not the handles. The ceiling, not the floor. Secondary. Jess whispered into her comms. "Go through the window." The team pivoted seamlessly. A sledgehammer took out the iron grating on the adjacent window. Jess went through first, tumbling over the sill and coming up on one knee in the darkness of a kitchen. The house smelled like rotting fruit and stale sweat. Gunfire erupted outside. The Marines on the cordon were engaging squirters. The deep, heavy rhythm of O'Connor's machine gun chewed through the night air. Inside, it was a ghost hunt. Jess cleared the hallway, stepping deliberately high over the thresholds. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to crack them. She wasn't a Tier 1 operator right now. She was a prey animal walking back into the cage. The white scars on her neck felt like they were on fire. 2 men came out of a side room, raising AK-47s. Jess didn't blink. 2 suppressed coughs from her rifle. The men dropped like heavy sacks of grain, the life leaving them before they hit the floor. She stepped over them. Last room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. Faint yellow light spilled onto the dirt floor. Jess paused by the frame. She closed her eyes, listened. A ragged, frantic breathing. The rustle of paper. The heavy clack of a laptop closing. She didn't kick the door. She pushed it gently with the muzzle of her rifle and sliced the pie, stepping into the room. He was older, fatter. His beard was graying. He wore a cheap track jacket and sandals. He was desperately trying to shove a hard drive into a canvas bag. Tariq. He looked up, freezing as the laser module of Jess's rifle painted a solid green dot squarely on his chest. There was no cinematic monologue. No grand realization. Tariq didn't recognize her. To him, she was just a faceless shadow in tactical gear, one of 1,000 he knew would eventually come for him. He didn't see the scarred woman from Ramadi. He just saw his death. His eyes darted from the rifle to a small, black radio detonator sitting on the table, 3 feet from his left hand. Jess watched the calculation in his eyes. She watched his muscles tense. She felt nothing. No righteous fury. No epic sense of justice. Just a deep, hollow exhaustion. Tariq lunged for the detonator. Jess pulled the trigger. Crack, crack. 2 rounds hit him in the sternum, throwing him backward into the plaster wall. He slid down, his eyes wide, choking on his own blood, his hands grasping at his chest. Jess walked forward. The smell of copper filled the small room. She stood over him. He looked up at her, the light fading rapidly from his eyes. He was drowning in his own lungs. She reached up with her left hand, pulling down the collar of her combat shirt, exposing the jagged, raised white lightning bolt of the scar on her neck. Tariq's eyes flicked to it. They widened. In the final, agonizing second of his life, recognition snapped into his pupils. A profound, absolute terror. Jess raised her rifle. Crack. The room went dead silent. She lowered the weapon. Her hands were shaking violently. She let out a long, shuddering breath, tasting the dust and the blood in the air. It was over. The ghost was dead. But the cold, heavy rock in her stomach didn't disappear. The scars still burned. She was still in the dark. Jackpot. Jess keyed her mic. Her voice was raspy, completely flat. Target secure. HVT is KIA. 20 minutes later, the compound was secured. Intel had scoured the house, finding enough hard drives and IED schematics to keep the NSA busy for a year. The ceiling above the front door had been packed with 40 pounds of homemade explosives. If they had breached it, the entire troop would have been vaporized. Jess walked out of the house into the cool desert air. The sky in the east was just beginning to turn the color of a bruised plum. She walked toward the extraction zone. As she passed the perimeter wall, she saw Dunn. He was leaning against the hood of an MRAP, his rifle hanging limply on its sling. His face was smeared with dirt and grease, his eyes wide and hollow. The reality of the violence had stripped the arrogance right out of his bones. He watched Jess walk past. He saw the blood splattered across her boots. He saw the dead, 1,000-yard stare in her eyes. He looked at the thick white scar snaking out of her collar, and for the first time, he didn't see a punchline. He saw the toll. Dunn slowly, unconsciously, stood up straighter as she passed. He didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. Jess didn't acknowledge him. She kept walking toward the waiting helicopters, blending into the dust and the noise, carrying the ghosts with her into the dawn.